The loneliest place in the world is a room full of people who have already decided where you belong. Maya Bennett first saw the Vance estate from the passenger seat of Julian's car as they drove along the coastal road overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. The mansion stood on a rise above the water, elegant and timeless against the late afternoon sky. For years she had imagined meeting Julian's family. She imagined nervous introductions, awkward conversations, perhaps even a few uncomfortable moments. What she never imagined was feeling invisible before she had even crossed the front door. Julian reached for her hand as the car approached the entrance. "They're going to love you," he said with a smile. Maya smiled back because she wanted to believe him. The front doors opened before they reached the steps. Staff members greeted them warmly. Family members appeared moments later. Smiles. Handshakes. Compliments. Perfect manners. Perfect hospitality. Everything looked exactly the way it should. Yet within minutes Maya began noticing something she could not explain. Every conversation seemed to begin half a step before she arrived. Every shared laugh belonged to a memory she had never lived. Every story referenced people, traditions, or events she did not understand. Nobody excluded her intentionally. Nobody ignored her directly. Still, she felt like someone reading a novel after skipping the first 10 chapters. Eleanor Vance arrived last. The matriarch carried herself with effortless grace. Her welcome was polite, warm even. She embraced Julian, then turned toward Maya with a smile that revealed nothing. "We are very happy to finally meet you." Maya thanked her. Eleanor nodded approvingly. "Julian speaks highly of you." The compliment should have felt reassuring. Instead Maya noticed the slight pause that followed. Just long enough to suggest an unfinished thought. The afternoon continued through guided tours, introductions, and conversations. Maya tried her best to participate. Yet small moments accumulated quietly. Family photographs lined the hallways. Nobody explained them. Relatives referenced traditions she did not know. Nobody clarified them. During one conversation, several family members burst into laughter at a decades-old story. Maya smiled politely without understanding the joke. Nobody noticed. Or perhaps nobody realized she was the only person in the room who had not lived through the memory. Later, as the family prepared for a group photograph in the gardens, everyone moved instinctively into position. Parents stood beside children. Siblings gathered together. Longtime family friends joined naturally. Maya hesitated several feet away, uncertain whether she belonged in the picture. Before she could decide, the photographer called for everyone to look forward. Julian eventually noticed and waved her over. She joined him quickly. Yet the uncertainty remained. She had not known where to stand because nobody had created a space for her. The moment lasted only seconds. The feeling remained much longer. Throughout the afternoon, Eleanor occasionally offered observations that sounded perfectly harmless on the surface. The Vances have always valued tradition. Family history matters here. It takes time to understand how everything works. None of the statements were offensive. Yet together they created the strange sensation that Maya was being measured against standards she could not see. The estate itself seemed to reinforce the feeling. Every room reflected generations of shared history. Every hallway displayed evidence of belonging earned over decades. Maya admired it. She also felt overwhelmed by it. During dinner she finally experienced a brief moment of comfort. Eleanor noticed Maya struggling to identify one of the formal place settings and quietly offered assistance before anyone else could notice. The gesture was small. Genuine. Unexpectedly kind. Maya appreciated it immediately. For a moment she wondered whether her concerns had been exaggerated. Perhaps she simply needed more time. Perhaps everything would eventually feel easier. Then another relative asked Maya how long she had known Julian. The conversation shifted naturally toward their relationship. Several family members listened politely. When Maya finished, someone smiled and said, "What an interesting change." The comment sounded innocent enough. Yet nobody explained what it meant. The discussion moved forward before Maya could ask. Another small moment. Another quiet reminder that an earlier chapter existed somewhere beyond her reach. That night Maya stood alone on a balcony overlooking the ocean while lights glowed throughout the estate behind her. The air smelled of salt and summer grass. Inside the mansion, laughter drifted faintly through open windows. She watched the waves for several minutes before Julian found her. "You okay?" he asked. Maya nodded automatically. Of course. It was easier than explaining the truth. Easier than admitting she felt present but not included. Welcome but not embraced. Seen but not known. As Julian wrapped an arm around her shoulders, Maya looked back toward the brightly lit house. Everything about the estate appeared beautiful. Everything about the family appeared perfect. Yet for reasons she still could not explain, she already felt like someone standing outside a door everyone else had been invited through years ago. The most painful judgments are not spoken to your face. They are spoken when people think you are not part of the family yet. Maya Bennett woke the following morning determined to give herself time. One uncomfortable day did not define a family. One awkward gathering did not reveal the whole truth. She reminded herself of that repeatedly while preparing for breakfast inside the guest suite overlooking the gardens. The sunlight spilling through the windows seemed to support the idea. Everything felt calm. Reasonable. Temporary. By the time she joined the family downstairs, she had almost convinced herself that the unease she felt the previous day was simply nerves. Breakfast passed peacefully. Conversations flowed easily around the large dining table. Plans for charity events, business meetings, and upcoming family gatherings filled the discussion. Maya listened carefully, searching for opportunities to contribute. Sometimes she found them. Often she did not. Nobody excluded her directly. Yet decisions seemed to move around her rather than through her. At one point several family members began discussing an annual family tradition scheduled for later that week. Dates, locations, and responsibilities were assigned quickly. Maya listened for several minutes before realizing nobody had explained what the tradition actually was. She smiled politely and waited for clarification. It never came. Eventually Julian noticed her confusion and quietly explained it afterward. "You should have asked," he said gently. Maya smiled. Maybe. Yet privately she wondered why she had been expected to ask about something everyone else assumed she already understood. Later that afternoon Maya wandered through the estate alone while Julian attended a meeting with relatives. The grounds stretched for acres beyond the main house. Gardens, walking paths, guest cottages, and preserved historical structures reflected generations of family history. As she explored, she occasionally noticed subtle reminders that she remained an outsider. Family plaques commemorated achievements. Portraits celebrated milestones. Names repeated throughout the property. The Vance family history surrounded her from every direction. She admired it. Yet she could not find evidence that anyone imagined a future where she belonged within it. Near sunset she entered one of the smaller courtyards adjoining the west wing. Voices drifted from an open set of French doors nearby. Maya had no intention of listening. She actually intended to leave. Then she heard her own name. Instinct stopped her. The conversation came from several relatives gathered inside a sitting room. None of them sounded angry. None sounded malicious. In some ways that made what followed even worse. "Do you think this one is serious?" a woman asked casually. Another voice laughed softly. "Julian always seems serious." "That is not what I mean." A pause followed. "I mean her." Someone else responded. She seems nice enough. Nice enough. The phrase lingered. Then another voice joined the discussion. Maybe. But this family has seen situations like this before. Maya felt her stomach tighten. What situations? People becoming interested once they realize exactly how much the Vance name opens doors. Another relative immediately replied, that is unfair. Relief flickered briefly inside Maya. Then the defense weakened. Although I admit the timing surprised me too. The conversation continued. Not cruelly. Not viciously. Simply honestly. They discussed her background. Her career. Her relationship with Julian. They analyzed her presence the way investors might analyze a business proposal. No one mentioned love. No one mentioned happiness. No one mentioned who she actually was. Maya stood frozen beside the courtyard wall. The worst part was realizing they did not hate her. If they hated her, she could dismiss them. Instead, they viewed her as temporary. A possibility. A question mark. Someone whose motives required verification. Eventually, one voice asked whether Eleanor approved of the relationship. Silence followed briefly. Then someone answered. Eleanor is being polite. Several people laughed knowingly. She always is. Maya quietly stepped away before hearing anything else. The walk back to the main house felt much longer than before. For the first time she understood that the problem extended beyond Eleanor. This was not one person's disapproval. It was a system. A family ecosystem built over generations. Everyone knew their role. Everyone knew the rules. Everyone understood the history. Everyone except her. That evening Julian found her sitting alone near the edge of the property overlooking the ocean. He immediately noticed something was wrong. Talk to me, he said softly. Maya hesitated. Then she told him what she heard. Julian listened carefully before shaking his head. You are overthinking this. The words arrived without malice. Without intention. Without awareness. Yet they landed heavily. They do not know you yet, he continued. Once they spend more time with you, everything will change. Maya stared toward the horizon. Julian genuinely believed what he was saying. That was what hurt most. He did not see the problem because he had never lived outside the circle. He belonged automatically. She did not. As darkness settled across the estate, Maya realized something she had not wanted to admit. Yesterday she felt uncertain. Today she felt judged. And for the first time since arriving, she began wondering whether everyone else had already decided who she was long before she ever had a chance to introduce herself. Sometimes the most impossible rival is someone who is no longer there and yet somehow never left. Maya Bennett first heard Chloe Sterling's name 3 days after arriving at the Vance estate. The name appeared casually during lunch. One relative mentioned an old charity project. Another smiled at a memory. Someone else referenced a gala held several years earlier. The conversation lasted less than a minute. Yet Maya immediately noticed something unusual. The room changed whenever Chloe's name appeared. Faces softened. Voices warmed. Even Eleanor smiled differently. Maya said nothing at the time. She simply listened. Later that afternoon she found herself noticing the name everywhere. A framed photograph displayed in a hallway. A commemorative plaque near one of the gardens. A cookbook in the kitchen with handwritten notes attributed to Chloe. Small details. Harmless details. Yet together they formed a pattern. Chloe was not merely remembered here. She remained present. That evening Maya finally asked Julian about her. They sat overlooking the ocean from one of the estate's terraces while waves crashed softly against the cliffs below. Julian remained quiet for several moments before answering. Chloe and I were engaged. Maya felt the words settle heavily inside her chest. Julian continued carefully. A long time ago. He spoke with respect rather than longing. Yet even that distinction offered little comfort. Maya nodded slowly. Why didn't you tell me? Julian looked surprised. I thought I had. He genuinely believed it. Maya almost laughed. Of course he did. For someone raised inside this family, Chloe belonged to the background. A familiar chapter everyone already knew. For Maya, the revelation felt completely different. Everyone talks about her, Maya said quietly. Julian looked toward the ocean. People loved her. The simplicity of the answer somehow made everything worse. The following day Maya discovered just how deeply Chloe's presence extended throughout the estate. During a tour of one of the family foundation buildings, she noticed Chloe's name engraved beside several long-term projects. At lunch she learned one of the estate's most beloved recipes came from Chloe. In the gardens she discovered that an entire section had been designed around ideas Chloe proposed years earlier. Everywhere Maya turned, traces remained. Not preserved as relics. Integrated into daily life. Living history rather than memory. Eventually curiosity overcame caution. Maya began searching through old photographs displayed throughout the estate. She expected elegance. She expected privilege. What she found instead was belonging. Chloe appeared beside Eleanor during charity events. Chloe laughed with relatives during holidays. Chloe stood shoulder to shoulder with family members in photographs spanning years. The images did not portray a guest. They portrayed someone who already belonged. For the first time, jealousy appeared. Maya hated herself for feeling it. Yet she could not deny it. Every photograph seemed to reinforce the same message. Chloe had not been preparing to join the Vance family. She had already joined it. Later that afternoon Maya entered a gallery corridor she had not previously explored. At the far end stood a large portrait covered by a protective cloth. Curiosity drew her closer. Before she could stop herself, she gently lifted one corner. The breath left her lungs immediately. It was an engagement portrait. Julian and Chloe stood together smiling toward the camera. Elegant. Confident. Certain of the future ahead of them. The painting had never been displayed publicly, yet it had never been removed either. Maya stared at it for several long moments. Then she noticed something even more painful. A plaque rested beneath the frame. The inscription referred to future plans once intended to celebrate the marriage between Julian Vance and Chloe Sterling. The wedding had been announced. The future had been prepared. The family had expected her arrival. Maya slowly lowered the protective cloth. For the first time she understood the true scale of what she faced. Chloe was not an old girlfriend. Chloe was the future daughter-in-law. Eleanor's chosen successor. The woman everyone assumed would eventually become Mrs. Vance. Walking back toward the main house, Maya found herself imagining someone she had never met. Eleanor's Chloe. Julian's Chloe. The family's Chloe. The perfect version preserved through memory. She suddenly realized something uncomfortable. She knew none of these versions were necessarily real. Yet she was already beginning to compete against them anyway. That evening Julian found her unusually quiet during dinner. What's wrong? He asked later. Maya hesitated before answering. Nothing. It was not the truth. The truth was far more complicated. For the first time since arriving, Maya no longer felt like she was competing against expectations. She felt like she was competing against a legacy. And as she looked back toward the illuminated estate standing above the ocean, one question refused to leave her mind. How do you build a future inside a home that still seems designed for someone else? The moment someone compares you to a ghost, you realize you were never competing for a place in the room. You were competing for a place in someone's memory. The family dinner began beautifully. Crystal glasses reflected warm light across the dining room. Conversations flowed easily between generations gathered around the long table overlooking the ocean. Laughter appeared often. The atmosphere felt elegant, comfortable, and familiar. Maya Bennett entered hoping things might finally improve. After discovering the truth about Chloe's engagement, she wanted to believe her fears had exaggerated reality. She wanted evidence that the future still belonged to the living rather than the past. For a while, dinner seemed to support that hope. The discussion began with upcoming charity events organized by the Vance Foundation. Several relatives exchanged ideas about fundraising initiatives and community outreach programs. Maya listened carefully. This was an area she genuinely understood. When an opportunity appeared, she offered a thoughtful suggestion regarding local partnerships and volunteer coordination. The idea received polite approval from several people around the table. Maya felt a brief sense of relief. Then someone smiled and said, "That is interesting." Chloe always approached community projects differently. The room grew quiet for half a second. Not long enough to create discomfort. Long enough to create damage. The conversation immediately continued. Nobody intended harm. Nobody corrected the comment either. Maya forced a smile and remained silent. Across the table, Julian noticed the change in her expression. Yet before he could respond, another discussion began. This time the subject involved family traditions. One relative described an annual foundation gala. Another mentioned how complicated planning had become in recent years. Eleanor listened quietly. Then someone laughed and said, Chloe could organize an entire event with half the preparation. Several people smiled warmly at the memory. Maya lowered her eyes toward her plate. Again the comparison sounded harmless. Again nobody seemed to recognize what it implied. The evening continued. Story after story. Memory after memory. Each one reinforced the same invisible hierarchy. Chloe remembered every staff member's name. Chloe loved a certain family tradition. Chloe always knew how to handle difficult situations. Chloe made people feel comfortable. Maya slowly realized something terrifying. Nobody was comparing her to Chloe because they disliked her. They were comparing her because Chloe remained their standard. That truth hurt far more. At one point a relative asked Maya whether she enjoyed life at the estate. Before she could answer, another voice responded with a laugh. It takes time. Chloe adapted immediately. The room fell silent. This time everyone heard it. Nobody spoke. Nobody challenged it. Nobody changed the subject. Maya felt the humiliation arrive slowly rather than all at once. Eleanor sat only a few feet away. Their eyes met briefly. For a moment Maya believed Eleanor might intervene. She understood. She saw the pain. She had the power to stop it. Instead she remained silent. The conversation eventually moved forward. The damage remained behind. Later, when dinner ended, Maya stepped outside onto the terrace overlooking the dark ocean. The cool air offered relief from the suffocating atmosphere inside. She stared toward the distant horizon while trying to steady her thoughts. A few minutes later Julian joined her. They did not mean it that way, he said immediately. Maya closed her eyes. Of course that was his first response. Do you even hear yourself? She asked quietly. Julian looked confused. They loved Chloe. That is all. Maya turned toward him. That is all? The hurt inside her finally surfaced. Every conversation becomes about her. Every memory becomes about her. Every comparison becomes about her. Julian sighed. You are making this bigger than it is. The words landed harder than anything said during dinner. Not because they were cruel. because they revealed how little he understood. Maya stared at him in disbelief. "You belong here," she said softly. "You have never had to wonder whether there is a place for you." Julian opened his mouth to respond but stopped. For the first time uncertainty appeared on his face. Yet even then he did not fully understand. Maya could see it. He viewed the situation as a misunderstanding. She experienced it as a wound. The difference between those perspectives suddenly felt enormous. After Julian returned inside, Maya remained alone on the terrace. Through the windows she watched members of the family continue laughing together. The sight should have felt comforting. Instead it reinforced a painful realization. Chloe was no longer present. Yet somehow Chloe remained at every dinner table, inside every tradition, within every conversation, and behind every expectation. Maya had spent days trying to earn acceptance. Now she wondered whether acceptance was ever available to begin with. Because for the first time since arriving at the Vance estate, she no longer felt excluded from the family. She felt compared to someone she could never possibly become. The moment you stop fighting for a place in someone's future is the moment you realize they never made room for you in the first place. Maya Bennett discovered Chloe's room by accident. At least that was what she told herself later. In truth, part of her had been searching for answers ever since the dinner. Ever since the comparisons. Ever since she realized Chloe was not simply remembered by the Vance family but woven into the fabric of their lives. The discovery happened on a quiet afternoon while most of the family attended meetings elsewhere on the estate. Maya wandered through a private wing she had never explored before. The hallway felt different from the rest of the mansion. More personal. More protected. At the very end stood a closed door. Nothing about it seemed unusual except for one detail. Unlike every other room, this door looked untouched by time. Curiosity pulled her forward. When she opened it, the breath left her lungs. The room was perfect. Not abandoned. Not neglected. Preserved. Sunlight filtered softly through large windows overlooking the ocean. Fresh flowers sat beside the bed. Shelves remained organized. Books rested exactly where someone had last placed them. The space felt less like a room and more like a museum dedicated to a life paused in motion. Maya stepped inside slowly. Every object seemed to tell the same story. Someone had expected Chloe to return. Photographs lined the shelves. Framed sketches decorated the walls. A wedding planner rested on a nearby desk. Maya approached it carefully. Her hands trembled as she opened the cover. Names. Dates. Venue preparations. Guest lists. Floral arrangements. Seating plans. Everything had been designed around a future that never happened. The realization struck harder than anything she had experienced so far. Chloe had not been a possibility. Chloe had been certainty. Maya continued exploring. On one wall hung architectural renderings connected to future foundation projects. Chloe's name appeared beside them. In another corner she found charity proposals prepared years earlier. Chloe's notes filled the margins. She found photographs showing Chloe participating in family holidays, charity events, celebrations, and private moments spanning years. Not one or two memories. An entire life. An entire future. An entire place within the family. Maya finally understood what had been haunting her since arriving. The estate had not been built around memories of Chloe. The estate had been built with Chloe inside its future. Every tradition. Every expectation. Every plan. She was everywhere. And Maya was nowhere. The sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find Eleanor standing quietly in the doorway. For several seconds neither woman spoke. Eleanor looked around the room. Then she looked back at Maya. "I wondered when you would find it." Maya swallowed hard. You kept everything. Eleanor nodded. Yes. There was no denial. No embarrassment. No attempt to hide the truth. Maya looked around the room again. Why? Eleanor's answer came softly. Because I loved her. Tears gathered behind Maya's eyes. More than you could ever love me? The question escaped before she could stop it. Pain crossed Eleanor's face. For a moment Maya thought she might finally receive the reassurance she had been searching for. Instead Eleanor gave her honesty. I do not know. The words shattered something inside Maya. Not because they were cruel. Because they were true. Maya stared at her in disbelief. Eleanor continued quietly. You are asking me to compare someone I lost with someone I am still trying to know. Silence filled the room. Maya felt the last fragile pieces of hope slipping away. Everything suddenly made sense. The comparisons. The traditions. The photographs. The silence during dinner. This room. None of it had been accidental. None of it had been temporary. Chloe belonged here. Maya did not. At least not yet. Perhaps not ever. For the first time since arriving, Maya stopped feeling angry. Anger required hope. Anger required belief that things could change. What replaced it felt much worse. Acceptance. She looked around the room one final time. Then she nodded slowly. I understand. Eleanor appeared as though she wanted to say something more. She never did. Maya left the room quietly. That evening she packed her belongings. Julian found her halfway through. Shock appeared on his face immediately. Then panic. He pleaded. Explained. Apologized. Promised things would improve. For the first time Maya saw genuine fear in him. Yet the words arrived too late. Julian finally understood what she had been experiencing. But understanding could not repair what had already broken. As night settled over the estate, Maya carried her suitcase toward the front entrance. The ocean roared softly beyond the cliffs. Lights glowed behind her throughout the mansion. A home built for generations. A future built for Chloe. Maya paused briefly before stepping outside. Then she kept walking. Not because she stopped loving Julian. Not because she hated Eleanor. Not because she wanted revenge. She left because she finally believed something the family had been showing her since the day she arrived. This place belonged to someone else. And for the first time, Maya no longer had the strength to pretend otherwise. The person you fear most can become the person who saves you, and sometimes that changes everything. Maya Bennett spent the next several days away from the Vance estate. She stayed at a small cottage near the shoreline nearly 20 miles from the mansion, close enough to remember everything and far enough to stop hearing it. At first she tried not to think about the family. She tried not to think about Eleanor's answer. She tried not to think about the preserved room, the engagement plans, or the future that had once belonged to Chloe Sterling. Yet grief has a way of following people even when they leave the place where it began. Every morning Maya woke carrying the same exhaustion. Every evening she went to sleep replaying the same memories. Eventually she stopped trying to avoid them. One rainy afternoon she opened a box of personal items she had accidentally brought with her after leaving the estate. Most of the contents were ordinary documents and photographs gathered during her stay. While sorting through them, she discovered something folded between several papers from Chloe's room. A handwritten letter. The pages were unfinished. The final sentences ended abruptly. Maya immediately recognized the handwriting. Chloe. For several minutes she simply stared at the pages. Part of her wanted to put them away. Another part needed answers. Finally she began reading. The letter was not addressed to Julian. Nor to Eleanor. Instead, it appeared to be a private reflection written during a difficult period of Chloe's life. Maya expected explanations. She expected revelations. Perhaps even confessions. Instead, she found something entirely different. Compassion. Chloe wrote about the people she loved. She wrote about her fears. She wrote about the responsibility she felt toward those around her. Again and again Maya encountered a woman completely unlike the rival she had imagined. There was no arrogance. No sense of ownership. No evidence that Chloe viewed herself as superior to anyone. The further Maya read, the more confused she became. This was not the enemy she had spent weeks fighting inside her mind. Then she reached one unfinished section near the end of the letter. The words stopped her completely. Chloe had written, "If someone ever stands where I once stood, I hope they are welcomed more gently than I was. Love should never feel like something that must be earned." Maya read the sentence again. Then again. Tears filled her eyes almost immediately. For weeks she had imagined Chloe as the source of her suffering. The standard she could never reach. The perfect woman whose memory continued haunting every room inside the estate. Yet here, in Chloe's own words, Maya found the opposite. Empathy. Kindness. Understanding. Chloe had never been competing against her. Chloe had never even known she would exist. Somehow the woman Maya feared most had become the first person to truly understand her pain. Maya lowered the letter slowly. For several minutes she simply cried. Not because the sentence explained anything. Because it removed something. It removed the anger she had attached to Chloe. It removed the rivalry. It removed the invisible conflict she had been carrying since discovering the engagement portrait. For the first time, Maya saw Chloe as a human being instead of a symbol. Later that evening Maya drove back toward the estate. Not to return. Not yet. She only wanted answers. As she approached the property, she noticed lights glowing inside the mansion. Through one window she caught sight of Julian standing alone in a room near the western wing. Something about his posture made her stop. He looked exhausted. Defeated. She watched from a distance without entering. Julian sat at a table surrounded by unopened documents. For several minutes he remained completely motionless. Then he picked up a photograph. Even from outside Maya recognized it immediately. A photograph of them together. Julian stared at it before lowering his head into his hands. The image lasted only seconds. Yet it revealed something Maya had not fully considered before. He was hurting too. Not in the same way. Not for the same reasons. But still hurting. For the first time since leaving, Maya felt uncertainty replace anger. Perhaps she had been right to leave. Perhaps she had been wrong about other things. The world suddenly felt more complicated than before. As night settled across the shoreline, Maya returned to her cottage carrying Chloe's unfinished letter with her. The ocean outside remained restless beneath the darkness. Inside, Maya read the pages one final time before placing them carefully beside her bed. The questions had not disappeared. The pain had not disappeared. Yet something fundamental had changed. The story no longer felt simple. Chloe was no longer a ghost haunting the family. She was becoming a person. And for the first time since arriving at the Vance estate, Maya found herself wondering whether everyone inside that family had been carrying a different version of Chloe all along. The hardest truths are the ones that force you to stop choosing sides. Maya Bennett returned to the unfinished letter again and again over the following days. Not because it answered every question. Because it refused to. The more she read Chloe's words, the more complicated the entire story became. For weeks Maya had organized her pain into simple categories. There were people who hurt her. There were people who failed her. There were people she blamed. The letter quietly dismantled that certainty. One afternoon Maya contacted a longtime foundation administrator whose name appeared repeatedly throughout old family records. She hoped to learn more about Chloe. What began as a brief conversation eventually lasted several hours. Story after story emerged. Not stories about perfection. Stories about sacrifice. The administrator described Chloe staying late after charity events to help staff clean up long after guests had left. He described her remembering birthdays nobody else remembered. He described countless small acts of kindness that rarely appeared in photographs or public recognition. Then he shared one memory Maya never forgot. Years earlier, Eleanor had fallen seriously ill for several weeks. The situation was not life-threatening, but recovery proved difficult. During that period, Chloe visited almost every day. She reorganized schedules, coordinated family obligations, sat with Eleanor during long afternoons when most relatives were busy. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, a member of the household staff found Chloe asleep in a chair beside Eleanor's bed with a blanket draped over both of them. Chloe never mentioned it afterward. She never sought praise. She simply showed up because someone she loved needed her. The image stayed with Maya long after the conversation ended. For the first time she understood why Eleanor's grief felt so deep. This was not merely a future daughter-in-law. This was someone who had already become family. Later Maya discovered another piece of Chloe's story. One that changed everything. Through old correspondence and conversations with people who knew the situation, she learned that Chloe's departure had not been caused by a lack of love. Quite the opposite. Chloe loved Julian deeply. She loved the family too. Yet circumstances beyond her control eventually convinced her that staying would create suffering for people she cared about most. The details mattered less than the realization itself. Chloe had not walked away from the future. She had sacrificed it. Maya sat alone near the shoreline for hours after learning the truth. Waves rolled steadily toward the beach while evening light faded across the horizon. Her emotions shifted constantly. Sadness, sympathy, confusion, regret. The strange thing was that none of these feelings erased her own pain. She still remembered every comparison, every humiliation, every moment she felt invisible. Yet for the first time she could no longer view herself as the only wounded person in the story. Chloe suffered. Eleanor suffered. Julian suffered. Even the family carried grief in ways she had never fully considered. The realization unsettled her. Human beings prefer simple stories. Villains, victims, heroes. This story refused to fit those categories. That night Maya found herself revisiting her final argument with Julian. For weeks she had replayed the conversation while focusing entirely on her own hurt. Now she remembered something else. The look on his face after she left. The panic. The helplessness. The realization arriving too late. Maya finally understood that Julian's greatest failure had not been a lack of love. It had been blindness. He belonged so completely to his family's world that he never noticed how isolated she felt standing outside it. That failure remained real. Yet it no longer felt malicious. As darkness settled outside her cottage window, Maya unfolded Chloe's letter one more time. This time she noticed something she had overlooked before. The unfinished pages contained no bitterness, no resentment, no anger toward the family she left behind. Only concern for the people she loved. Maya slowly placed the letter back on the table. Then she stared out toward the ocean. For the first time since arriving at the Vance estate, certainty disappeared completely. She no longer knew who was right. She no longer knew who was wrong. She only knew that grief had trapped every person inside a different version of the same story. Chloe became a memory. Eleanor became a guardian of that memory. Julian became a prisoner of the world he inherited. Maya became the person forced to confront all of it. Somewhere between the waves and the silence, a difficult truth finally emerged. The family had hurt her. That remained true. But they were not monsters. They were good people carrying wounds they never learned how to heal. And for the first time, Maya found herself wondering whether understanding someone else's pain might be the beginning of something even harder than anger. Understanding someone's pain does not mean you are ready to forgive it. Maya Bennett spent the following week carrying two truths that refused to fit together. The first was that the Vance family had hurt her deeply. The second was that she finally understood why. Neither truth canceled the other. That realization became the hardest part of all. One morning she returned to the estate grounds for the first time since leaving. Not to see anyone. Not to announce her return. She simply walked through the public gardens surrounding the property. The familiar paths felt different now. For weeks she had viewed every corner of the estate as evidence of rejection. Now she noticed something else. Chloe's presence existed everywhere, but not in the way she originally imagined. The flower beds near the southern terrace had been designed according to one of Chloe's old sketches. A community scholarship program carried ideas she helped develop years earlier. The annual charity event still followed traditions she introduced. The entire estate contained traces of her influence. Yet instead of feeling threatened, Maya felt something unexpected. Sadness. Not for herself. For everyone. The family had never truly moved forward because they never truly let go. Later that afternoon Maya visited a quiet section of the property overlooking the water. She sat alone on a wooden bench facing the shoreline. Wind moved softly through the trees while distant waves rolled against the coast. No conversations interrupted her thoughts. No revelations appeared. No dramatic answers arrived. For the first time since discovering the truth about Chloe, Maya simply sat with it. She thought about Eleanor. She thought about Julian. She thought about the unfinished letter resting inside her bag. Most importantly, she thought about herself. Gradually Maya recognized something she had been avoiding. She did not need to decide immediately whether Eleanor deserved forgiveness. She did not need to excuse what happened. She did not need to pretend the comparisons never hurt. Understanding and forgiveness were not the same thing. Acceptance existed between them. Acceptance meant acknowledging reality without fighting it. Acceptance meant recognizing that grief had shaped the family's behavior long before she arrived. Acceptance meant admitting that everyone involved carried responsibility for different mistakes. The realization settled quietly rather than dramatically. Maya remained on the bench until sunset painted the horizon with soft shades of gold and blue. When she finally stood, something inside her felt lighter. The pain remained. The memories remained. Yet the struggle against reality had begun to fade. That evening another conversation changed everything. Maya met someone who had known Eleanor and Chloe closely during the years before Chloe disappeared from the family's future. During their discussion Maya asked a question she had never asked before. What was Eleanor like back then? The answer surprised her. The woman described Eleanor not as a powerful social figure or strict family matriarch but as a proud mother who genuinely believed she had gained a daughter. She described shopping trips, holiday traditions, private jokes, long conversations about future plans. She described Eleanor introducing Chloe as family long before any wedding took place. Then came the sentence Maya could not forget. After Chloe left, Eleanor stopped talking about the future the same way. Suddenly dozens of memories aligned. The preserved room. The engagement portrait. The traditions frozen in time. The refusal to let go. Maya finally saw the full picture. Eleanor had not spent years protecting a future daughter-in-law. She had spent years mourning a daughter she never stopped loving. The realization did not erase the hurt Eleanor caused. Yet it transformed its meaning. For the first time, Maya felt compassion without surrendering her own truth. She could acknowledge Eleanor's pain while still honoring her own. As darkness settled over the estate, Maya walked slowly toward the main house before stopping several yards away. Lights glowed warmly behind the windows. Somewhere inside, Eleanor continued carrying her grief. Somewhere inside, Julian continued carrying his regret. Maya stood silently for several moments. She did not knock on the door. She did not announce herself. Instead, she turned away and began walking back toward her car. Not because she was leaving forever. Because something important had happened. For the first time since arriving at the Vance estate, Maya no longer felt trapped between anger and forgiveness. She had entered the space between them. The quiet place where acceptance begins. And somewhere within that silence, the possibility of healing finally became real. Sometimes belonging begins the moment you stop asking for permission to belong. Maya Bennett returned to the Vance estate on a quiet afternoon beneath a pale coastal sky. The familiar gates opened slowly as her car approached. Weeks earlier she had passed through those same gates filled with hope. Later she left carrying heartbreak. Now she returned carrying something entirely different. Understanding. Not certainty. Not victory. Understanding. The mansion appeared unchanged against the horizon. Yet everything felt different because Maya had changed. When she stepped inside, silence greeted her first. Then footsteps. Julian appeared at the far end of the hall. For a moment neither moved. The distance between them felt larger than the room itself. Then Julian crossed it in seconds. Emotion overwhelmed him before words could. Maya immediately saw what grief and regret had done during her absence. He looked exhausted. Older somehow. As though losing her had forced him to finally see everything he failed to see before. Neither of them rushed toward forgiveness. Neither pretended the pain had never happened. Yet standing together again felt like the first honest moment they had shared since her arrival. Later that evening Maya asked to speak with Eleanor. They met alone inside the room that had once belonged to Chloe. The same room that shattered Maya's heart weeks earlier. The same room Eleanor had protected for years. Sunlight faded softly through the windows while silence settled between them. Eventually Eleanor spoke first. I never expected you to come back. Maya looked around the room one final time. Then she answered honestly. Neither did I. For several moments neither woman spoke. Then Maya removed Chloe's unfinished letter from her bag and placed it gently on the table between them. Eleanor stared at it. Her expression changed immediately. Maya watched emotions move across her face. Surprise. Recognition. Grief. Love. The years seemed visible all at once. I know who Chloe was now, Maya said quietly. Eleanor lowered her eyes. No, she replied. Softly. You know who she tried to be. None of us ever knew everything. The answer felt strangely comforting. Even Chloe remained human. Not a legend. Not a symbol. A person. Maya took a slow breath. For a long time I thought Chloe stood between us. Eleanor looked toward the letter. I thought so too. Tears filled her eyes. I spent years protecting her memory because I was terrified of losing her again. The confession hung in the air. Honest. Painful. Human. Then Eleanor stood and walked toward a large cabinet near the far wall. She opened it slowly. Inside rested the engagement portrait that had once dominated the room. The image that symbolized an entire future frozen in time. Maya watched as Eleanor carefully removed it. Her hands trembled. Not from weakness. From grief. I cannot stop loving her, Eleanor whispered. And I should not have asked everyone else to live inside that grief with me. For a moment Eleanor simply held the portrait. Then she carried it towards storage shelves at the back of the room. Not discarded. Not forgotten. But released from its place of honor. The gesture cost her something. Maya could see it. Years of fear. Years of protection. Years of holding on. When Eleanor returned, tears streamed openly down her face. I am sorry, she said. Not because Chloe existed. Not because I loved her. But because I made you feel like there was no room for you. Maya felt emotion rise unexpectedly inside her chest. She thought about the comparisons. The dinner. The silence. The preserved future. The letter. The grief. The understanding. The acceptance. Finally she answered. I am not here to replace Chloe. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. Then she smiled through tears. You never needed to. Another silence followed. Yet this one felt different. Not empty. Peaceful. Maya looked around the room one last time. The room no longer felt like a museum. It no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like what it should have been all along. A place where someone had once been loved. Nothing more. Nothing less. Eleanor reached for Maya's hand. You already have a place of your own. The words landed differently now because Maya no longer needed them. That was why they mattered. She had stopped chasing acceptance. She had stopped competing with memory. She had stopped trying to become someone else. Outside, evening sunlight spread across the estate grounds. The gardens remained beautiful. The traditions remained. The family remained imperfect. The grief remained too. But something had changed. Not because anyone won. Not because anyone lost. Because everyone finally understood that they had all been suffering in different ways. Chloe was no longer a wall standing between them. She had become the bridge that led them back to one another. And as Maya stepped forward into the future waiting beyond the shadows of the past, she realized belonging had never been about taking someone else's place. It had always been about finding her own.